Why in the world do we call this Good Friday? How can crucifixion be good? How can torture and death be good? It's more like the worst Friday in human history. Now, most of the rest of the world, most of the non-English speaking world calls this Holy Friday. And it's just sort of an accident of the language, a coincidence in English that makes us look head on at the passion, at the crucifixion, and ask ourselves why it is good, why this is Good Friday. Now, there have been a lot of attempts to explain the mystery of Christ's death and how it is that Christ dying somehow reconciled humanity to God. In the ancient sacrificial system, the system that not only the Jews followed, but most of the other religions of the world at that time, there was the idea that you needed to make sacrifice to please your God, to propitiate your God, to pay off your God, essentially, to make your God not be angry with you. In the Jewish system, there was an additional level to this, an additional layer that had come more to the fore in the few hundred years before Jesus, that you made a sacrifice to sort of seal a deal with God. If you were confessing a sin, and at the end of your confession you wanted to sort of stamp it, you made a sacrifice at the temple, or when a child was born, or when you had taken a vow, you made a sacrifice as a way of sort of putting a stamp on that promise you had made to God. It's this sort of language of sacrifice, this sort of language that we somehow need to kill something to make God happy, to kill something to make God happy with us. We hear that in the language about Jesus as the great high priest. And in certainly a lot of the Old Testament language, but in the New Testament language where it talks about Jesus being both the victim of the sacrifice and the priest who performs the sacrifice, the one who is in charge, the one who is doing the sacrifice himself. And of course, if you're making a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the whole world, that sacrifice really needs to be something precious. It really needs to be of the highest order. Normally, the ram or the goat or the sheep would have to be unblemished, untouched. This required someone who was without sin to be this sacrifice. Now, after Jesus, in the early Middle Ages, the time we call the Dark Ages, Christianity sort of inherited a lot of the ideas about lots of gods, about good gods and bad gods, and we inherited some of the northern Germanic ideas about angels and devils and good spirits and bad spirits, and this idea that the world is sort of this cosmic battle between the good guys and the bad guys. And so this theory developed that the whole point of the crucifixion was to fool the devil. That God set it up so that the devil would think that he had won when he saw Christ crucified on the cross. And then 3 days later, Christ rises from the dead and the devil is beaten. It seems foolish to us now. It seems petty to us now to think about it in those terms. But think about that big scene at the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, when the White Queen believes that she has won because she has been able to kill Aslan, because she has been able to kill the great lion. And then later, when the lion arises, how dismayed she is. That's coming from that same sort of idea that this is not just about us. That this story about Jesus' crucifixion is not about us and something we're doing. This is this big cosmic battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, between God and the devil. And we're just really sort of standing by and watching. Toward the end of the Middle Ages, an Englishman, an English saint, one of our saints, a guy named Anselm of Canterbury, came up with the idea that has been current until fairly recently, this idea of substitutionary atonement. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with those terms, but the idea is that in a feudal society like they lived in the Middle Ages, if you insulted your lord, if you insulted your king, your earl, your baron, if you somehow did something to injure his dignity, his honor, that was a debt that had to be paid. That was not just an insult, that was a financial debt, because the honor of the Lord was a possession. And so by the great sin of the earth, we had all offended God's dignity. We had offended God's honor, and we had to do something to make that up to God. We had to find a way to pay that debt to God. And of course, the big problem with this is when God created the entire universe, and everything in the universe belongs to God, even our own lives, what could we possibly give to God to make up for this terrible insult we have made to God? And Anselm said it was out of God's grace that God gave His Son to be that sacrifice. We go back to the sacrifice idea again, that God paid the debt on our behalf in the blood of Jesus. And you hear that sort of thinking all the time in the songs and the people saying, Jesus paid my debt. Jesus paid the debt for my sins. My sins were paid in the blood of Christ. For hundreds of years, that was sort of the orthodox way of explaining this. Well, I've got to tell you, for me in our age, it's really hard to think about the God that I know and love needing to trade violence for violence. It's really hard for me to think about the God we worship demanding blood sacrifice in order for His honor to be assuaged, or in order for Him to be pleased and for Him to like us, that the blood must be spilt. For many folks today, having lived through so many generations of violence, for many folks, I think they would say that a bloodthirsty God like this is worse than no God at all. I honestly think that this is one of the reasons that so many folks in the 20th and 21st centuries have pulled away from these traditional ideas of God, because the idea of a God that would demand the death of His own Son to satisfy His honor is just too abhorrent. For us in our lifetimes, some of us may have learned, some of us may have been taught that the only way to overcome violence is with nonviolence. You don't overcome violence with more violence. You overcome violence by stopping the cycle, by nonviolence, by absorbing the violence and not returning it. So what if the point of the crucifixion is that Jesus is able to overcome the most powerful empire in the world? Jesus is able to overcome all these things that are arranged against Him, able to overcome this great machine of state, because He doesn't fight back. Because when Peter draws his sword and cuts off the high priest's slave's ear, Jesus says, "Put away your sword." What if Jesus can overcome violence and death because, like a good non-violent teacher, He absorbs the violence and death. He takes them into Himself and doesn't return them. The cycle ends. What if God isn't demanding payment from us? What if God isn't demanding sacrifice from us, but God is making God's self vulnerable to us? God is taking on human flesh, fragile, frail, breakable, injurable human flesh. God is accepting the torture and the pain and the death. What if it's not about us making a sacrifice to some bloodthirsty God, but about God making a sacrifice to us. God sacrificing God's Son. God sacrificing God's self to the most violent impulses in humanity. God is taking the worst that humanity has to offer, the most awful, violent, horrible, torturous things we can do. God's taking them all in Jesus. God is absorbing them all and still loving us. God is taking that all in and somehow still reconciling us to God. It's hard to think about this being a Good Friday, because we stand by in horror watching this violent, disgusting spectacle, hearing it read aloud, hearing our own voices shouting again and again, "Crucify him." We try to find some reason why it makes sense. We try to find some reason why it had to be this way. Why would God want it to be this way? It doesn't make sense. God didn't want it to be this way. How can crucifixion be good?